but to those of you who have already come, welcome. It's lovely to see you. And we're going to have a discussion this morning, as is obvious from the board and from your programs, that's connecting spirituality and sustainability. Now, my name is Marrocco, and along with Catherine Cooper, who is the director of the program, I'm a member of the faculty team for a professional program in corporate social responsibility and sustainability at the University of St. Michael's College. And that's what brings me to this table. And Catherine was the organizer of this panel. And we're really looking forward to this conversation with three folks who are here from the University of St. Michael's College, and I'll be introducing in a moment. So this notion of connection, connecting spirituality and sustainability, that connectedness really is at the very heart of not just the encyclical that we'll be discussing, panelists will be discussing this morning, but indeed I think it's at the heart of the very conference itself. And those of you who've been here for 3 days have probably realized that as you went from session to session talking about science and spirituality and the humanities. And this morning I understand there was a talk about labor, you've heard about water and energy. All these different elements of sustainability, and you've had an opportunity to make connections. And you'll notice even in your program, the opening paragraph of your program, Professor Shashi Kant wrote that no academic discipline, corporation, country, First Nation, government, or organization can achieve sustainability alone. It's up to all of those together, plus all of us together as individuals. And on Wednesday afternoon, and maybe some of you during yesterday's program, you may have attended a conversation, as I did, about sustainability and the sacred. Instead of looking around, did any of you happen to go to that conversation? Mm-hmm. So not unlike the focus of today's conversation, the panelists on the day that I was there on Wednesday afternoon were using illustrations from both science and sacred texts. And in their case, they were referring to Hebrew texts and to the Buddhist tradition. And they were emphasizing the deep connection between creator and creation, and indeed all of creation, including humans. So our three panelists this morning will offer their thoughts on that connectedness, and they'll be taking the encyclical by Pope Francis called Laudato Si as their starting point. Now, our format is going to be as follows. I'll provide you with a very brief biographical introduction to each speaker in turn, but I'll request that you hold your comments and questions until all three have had a chance to present their thoughts. And to help you formulate these, Catherine went around and handed out, I think, some index cards, and if you need more, just ask her for more. So our first speaker, sitting next to me here, is Dr. Moira McQueen. Dr. McQueen holds, again, talking about interdisciplinary. All of our speakers have this interesting academic background as well. So Dr. McQueen holds a law degree from the University of Glasgow, and there she specialized in family law and juvenile court matters. After moving to Canada, she gained a master's degree in divinity and a PhD in moral theology from the University of St. Michael's College, which, as many of you know, is part of the Toronto School of Theology. She is currently the executive director of the Canadian Catholic Bioethics Institute and is also a member of the Vatican Theological Commission, which advises the Pope and the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. This is a heavy-duty moral theology. So she's going to provide us with an overview of the notion of sustainability, specifically of faith, science, and climate change in Laudato Si.
Well, okay, you. Thank you. Thank you, Mimi. Thank you to all of you for being here. I'm sure it has been a really interesting conference. I haven't been able to attend, but I did look through the booklet, and I'm absolutely amazed at the interdisciplinary approach, and just to find out what other people are doing or are planning to do in this particular area is very inspiring and so very necessary. And as a moral theologian coming from a Catholic perspective, I really appreciate always the opportunity to make another connection between the scientific and the spiritual, the scientific and the religious, because that to so many of us, the science is so important. And I think that's why Laudato Si, this encyclical written by Pope Francis in 2015, struck a chord with so many people because it's coming from the Pope. Everybody expects it, of course, to be religious, spiritual, which it is. But he is really looking at climate change. He's looking at what's going on in the world. He's looking at reality, if you like. And I think that reality is really what we're all talking about in terms of who we are as people, what we will do, how we will care for the planet, which really means how we will care for us as well. So the interconnections are really myriad. And so I'm reading this talk, Connecting Spirituality and Sustainability, and I hope I don't go over my time. I will stop if I do immediately.
No, well, I think we have enough time. Okay.
Good. So Laudato Si, as I said, deals with one of our most urgent problems, of course, climate change and its consequences. And that makes the document itself universal or global in scope. It takes up the themes of our relationship to the Creator and creation, and all that is created, therefore, is immediately theological, religious, spiritual, and scientific because of the ground that it covers. The Pope critiques the human behavior that contributes to our climate problems, trying to show what factors are to blame. He suggests some solutions, and most importantly, though, calls us to change our problematic behaviors. We would call that, he's calling us to conversion, which is both spiritual and practical. Cardinal Turkson, who heads up one of the congregations of the Vatican on justice and peace, who's very involved in social justice matters, said of Laudato Si that it's among the most comprehensive of any papal encyclicals because in it the Pope integrates so many different ideas, from the environment to immigration, from the dangers of climate change to the urgency of food distribution, from political action on behalf of our common home, which he calls it our common home, to prayer and spirituality steeped in an awareness of creation, from action to stop pollution and deforestation, to contemplation of the goodness and of and praise for the God of all creatures, great and small. Very importantly, from a point of view of Catholic and not only Catholic teaching, from a very human point of view, he insists on placing the poor at the center of our lives. He's always talking about the peripheries. The people on the peripheries are the people to whom we should be paying the most attention because they are the ones who, in fact, suffer most at the minute from climate change. And it's no accident that the Synod in the Amazon is taking place right now in Rome, in the Vatican, where so many indigenous people are present, have a voice, and are able to express these very concerns. I read something this morning that just said, it was a statement from that synod, that the Synod in the Amazon is a child of Laudato Si. We can see what this Pope is trying to do in these areas. So from placing the poor at the center of our lives, not in the margins, not in the peripheries, to our concern for the cosmos in which we live. So my first point really is about the context of the encyclical itself, the context of Laudato Si, which means praise be. It means praise be to the Creator. It also in many ways means praise be and thanks for the gift of creation. So as it relates to sustainability, so we know we live in a world where industrial development, giant cities, overuse of resources, many other factors have led to ecological degradation and loss of biodiversity, with very important ones. So many hundreds of species are now extinct, but at the same time, basic needs such as water, food, and fuel are not available or less available for everyone. Just recently, one of the reserves in Northern Ontario has been in the news because for the past 25 years, they have been using bottled water, not just to drink, but for cooking and for using for hygiene. Their water source is completely contaminated. Many attempts made to fix it, not successful yet, and this is right here. So multiply that in many other areas, we can see we have local and global problems. Increasing global population, which has always been talked about at the UN, demands even more food, water, energy, etc., and is clearly placing unprecedented pressure on our ecosystems. Pope Francis insists that the problem is not just about increasing numbers of people. It's almost easy to point to that as a factor, and I'm not saying it's not. He talks about the ethical factors, that consumption and waste are culturally and socially entrenched in most of our Western particular societies, and we are resistant to change or reform. 20% of us consume 57% of the gross world profit, and wealthier countries, as we know, produce at least 46% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And using the measure of ecological footprints, human demands for resources we know can be tracked that show that consumption compared with the regenerative capacity of the planet to meet the demands, and it's clearly out of balance. Pope Francis accepts these scientific measurements as a valid basis for his response. He admits that religious communities are unlikely to be the major shapers of technical solutions to the planet's woes, but we can support a process of change or conversion directed at an increased sense of respect, care, and love for our planet. And one way or another, he reminds us that every single person has a role to play. And his approach takes the stance that scientific reasoning should be informed or could be informed by theology and spirituality, and vice versa. It's clear that both faith and science develop according to our interaction with the universe. One side asks more metaphysically about the meaning and the purpose of the universe, and the other investigates and tries to explain the physical universe. Both sides aim to discover more about all that exists through experience and exploration, seeking not just knowledge, but the truth of things. So Thomas Aquinas, from the Middle Ages, wrote that truth means seeing reality, seeing things as they truly are in themselves. And discovering that reality often takes time and investigation beyond just the literal seeing or observation. And human nature and human reason both drive us to seek and to question and to critique and to move forward in a never-expanding and evolving field of knowledge about reality. So Catholic teaching, therefore, accepts and uses scientific methods in its reasoning, and in some documents, for example in Bioethics, states that its conclusions could change should new scientific evidence warrant it. And this is similarly important in the field of measuring sustainability. Some question the whole idea of religion and spirituality in science, and ask, as they did of Pope Francis when he issued the document, what does the church, what do religious people know about climate change? And one response to that is they know a great deal, since in the Catholic Church anyway, the Pope regularly consults its own Pontifical Academy for Sciences, which is made up of some leading international experts, not all Catholic, as well as experts from other fields. And popes, people sometimes don't realize this, but popes frequently make use of such experts in writing their encyclicals, and it's well known that Pope Francis consulted many such experts in writing Laudato Si. And this is normal because it ensures credibility in fields that are not his own. Benedict XVI before him had said that experience shows that disregard for the environment always harms human coexistence and vice versa. He was emphasizing, as the point of this conference is, that everything is connected and everything is interdependent. He said we could say we are the planet and the planet is us. If the planet dies, we die. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis likewise emphasizes that interconnectedness of every creature on or with the planet, and calls us to recognize that interdependence, which in turn limits our individual autonomy. Another teaching from the Catholic aspect is from the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, which is dealing with social concerns clearly and social justice. And it has been saying for a long time that the environment is a collective good. In Catholic teaching, we would usually call it a common good, which is a fundamental tenet of our teaching, which means the fruits of the planet in general must be shared equitably. And beyond that, there's a further principle of Catholic social teaching, which posits what it calls the universal destination of goods, which means we do not have absolute rights over our goods, although we have a right to ownership, but not absolute rights. It means that those rights should yield to other people's needs. And it's usually called, and Pope Francis refers to this in Laudato Si, to the preferential option for the poor, which is something we're supposed to not just acknowledge, but subscribe to and put into practice. So with an option like that, here we're talking about sustainability in a more direct fashion, which obliges those who have plenty to redress the balance towards those who have little. And this is not charity, which is required in many different situations, but a moral obligation, which is fundamental to Laudato Si. So I'm just going to have a quick look at the chapters in Laudato Si. It's a very long document, most encyclicals are, but as I mentioned at the beginning, it ranges over such a wide variety of topics that it's really not surprising. So in chapter 1, Pope Francis called it, "What is happening to our common home?" And there he discusses the impact of climate change and the depletion of fresh water and loss of biodiversity. It points to the consensus concerning the negative impact of carbon-intensive economies on the natural world and human life. And he says, caring for ecosystems demands farsightedness, since no one looking for a quick and easy profit is truly interested in their preservation. He adds that the cost of the damage caused by such selfish lack of concern is much greater than the economic benefits to be obtained. And he cites the burning of tropical forests and damage, some permanent, to our oceans, coral reefs, marine life, and marine organisms, the whole chain, as part of that non-concern. And this was before, for example, the raging fires recently in Amazon and the initial non-response of the Brazilian president until he was almost forced by world opinion to do something serious about it. The Pope reiterated that a truly ecological approach is also inherently social, an approach that simultaneously hears the dual cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And he quotes the social and environmental impact of mining as an example of that, where the exploitation of the land and the subsequent exploitation of indigenous people are left without employment when companies leave the mines, usually Western, and in fact many Canadian companies, and we know are involved in this, when they leave the mines, when the profit's done, and leave the people without employment, but also with contaminated and unworkable sites. So they're damaged immediately and also in the future. The Pope lauds many achievements of the environmental movement, while at the same time critiquing some elements. For example, he rejects the idea that population growth is a major factor, as I mentioned, saying that this can be a convenient way of refusing to reduce overconsumption by the average. He warns the warming caused by overconsumption by some rich countries has repercussions in the poorest parts of the world, especially Africa, where a rise in temperature together with drought has proved devastating for farming. These situations, he says, have caused Sister Earth, along with all the abandon of our world, to cry out, pleading that we take another course. For him, the major problem is that we still lack the culture, by which he means the moral culture, to confront this crisis. And in section 54, he calls out international politicians for their weak responses. And it's clear where his mindset is coming from. He says, our politics are subject to technology and finance, trumping the common good. He acknowledges many countries are making significant progress, and again, it's clear looking today at the number of contributions that are coming from different sectors in society, including deforestation, for example. But at the same time, we have not changed this harmful habit of consumption. Okay, so I think I have probably far too much to go on because it's not. Better not waste time. I'll just go to one that I think is there are so many parts when Pope Francis is talking about integral ecology. But in chapter 3, he talks about, and I think this is most pertinent for people who are maybe not directly involved in working in the practical sense for changing, helping in climate change. He calls it the human roots of the ecological crisis. And here he examines twin notions. He says we are subject to the technocratic paradigm and a modern anthropocentrism that sees nature only as a physical reality, but with no real sense of its spiritual or transcendent value. And some of us have always thought that the Earth's resources are infinite, that economic growth and technology alone can solve global poverty and hunger. But the Pope comments that these approaches are just part of the ongoing attitude at the root of the common problem, the current problem. That this type of materialistic view of reality has resulted in disregard not only for the environment, but also disregard for the true work of human life. Human embryos, the poor, the elderly, or people with disability. Pope Francis points to our throwaway attitude to life, persons, and goods. It's one of his favorite expressions, that we discard what we perceive as risks. So his whole approach throughout the encyclical is to, first of all, talk about the scientific problems, to talk about the realities of climate change, which he does describe in fair detail, to embrace the scientific approach, again, because of that interconnectedness, that we have to see reality for what it is, we have to respond. Because he's the Pope, he is talking to us about our individual responsibility, that idea that every single one of us has a role to play. And he is calling, and not just to Catholic people. I think this is why this document made such a huge impact, because it's very measured. It's acknowledging what needs to be done. It's acknowledging, especially in Western cultures, that we have been resistant to change, that we're not changing fast enough. He points to some very minor things that people can do. He talks about our overuse of air conditioning, for example, and that affects just about everybody in this room. Nearly all sat in freezing rooms and put cardigans on in the summer. It's so back to front some of the times we do things. So he looks at things at the high level, he looks at things at the basic level, but most of all, I think he's stressing there is a problem. The problem is still solvable as long as every one of us will pay a bit more attention, not just to our own needs, but truly be more aware of the common good, the interconnectedness of all of us in the planet. And in a way, he's really calling us to a change, which he would also call conversion.
Thank you very much, Moira. Well, it's such a wonderful document that how many of you have actually looked at the document or have read it? Okay, so you know what's in those chapters. So James, you're going to pick up on this. Dr. James Ginther is a professor and a dean of the Faculty of Theology at the University of St. Michael's College. And again, the interdisciplinary nature of his studies is interesting because he holds a PhD in medieval studies. So back to Thomas Aquinas here, from the University of Toronto. And there he worked, he focused on the work of theologians, scientists, and statesmen whom I'm not familiar with, and I'll probably mispronounce his name. I would call it Robert Grosseteste, but that's probably the wrong pronunciation. Is that the right one? Because I'm not familiar with his work. And Jim previously taught at the University of Leeds in England and at St. Louis University. And there, again, this interdisciplinary stuff, he helped to create the Center for Digital Technology. And his science side was also evidenced in his contribution to the development of the so-called T-pen. I thought that was fascinating. This is a tool that allows the transcription of manuscripts right on the screen, thus avoiding the moving back and forth from screen to paper. So Dr. Ginther is going to talk to us about the deep roots of Laudato Si in the Catholic intellectual tradition. And he'll outline how this encyclical has drawn on a range of ideas from both the medieval and the modern tradition. And he'll talk about the terms of what it says, both positively and negatively about that tradition. Because sometimes people say, you know, religion gets in the way of the sustainability movement, right? So you're going to address that, I think.
Well, that's what I promised. See if I can actually fulfill that. In good Catholic action, I will let me begin with a confession. I'm here today as a member of this panel under somewhat false pretenses. Our panel today is discussing the role and impact of the papal encyclical Laudato Si in contemporary ethics, science, and Christian practice. I'm neither an ethicist nor a scientist, and although I claim to be committed to good Christian practice, I make no claim to any scholarly expertise in that area. So why am I here? Initially, I was a placeholder, so there would be space for that one of my colleagues, who was certainly more learned than I, could join us, and unfortunately, he was unable to do so. However, what had begun as a placeholder has evolved into something more significant. I am an historical theologian, and I focus on my research and teaching on pre-modern theology in Western Europe. So one might think that I might have little to say about an encyclical published in 2015. However, I believe I have something to contribute to this conversation here today, which seeks to facilitate interdisciplinary approaches to sustainability. Laudato Si has been hailed as a watershed document for the modern Roman Catholic Church. Finally, the Pope was staking out an unequivocal leadership role for Roman Catholics, developing policies and actions as a response to climate change. Like all watershed moments, this encyclical, some have argued, and actually just our previous speaker has done so very well, has its roots in the previous century of ideas and concepts that are often cataloged in the rubric of Catholic social teaching. The coming together of principles such as the dignity of every human life and the mandate to care for all of God's creation found an original articulation in this encyclical. Moreover, it could be used to counter, if not nullify, the negative impacts of some of the facets of the Catholic intellectual tradition that it has the negative aspects it's had on modern account of humanity's relationship with the universe and with the earth in particular. It is worth noting two pejorative facets in particular. There is first the notion that the Catholic intellectual tradition fostered an anthropocentrism of the created order. Now let me pause here momentarily to state that what I mean by the terms created order or creation. The theological discourse dating back to the first centuries of Christianity, the concept of creation demarcated an ontological distinction between God and all other things. Creation was a set of finite beings and objects. But in using that category, I am making no claim to the literal narrative of the 6 days of creation. In fact, a literal read of the Genesis narrative, is actually more of a recent, indeed a modern development of biblical interpretation. And instead, for much of the history of the Catholic intellectual tradition, the reading of the exemeral narratives was rendered in a way that conformed to the shared worldview of classical physics and metaphysics. There was significant diversity in that explanation of how things came to be, at least in the pre-modern tradition. And hence, modern theologians can easily speak of the created order as a product of evolutionary processes without contradiction in their theologies. What nearly all medieval theologians agreed upon was the preeminence of humanity in that created order. And this gave political and religious leaders in modern Western Europe license to present their nations as preeminent as they moved into the New World. Moreover, it then allowed Western nations, in particular, to develop a sense of the needs of humanity and primarily the needs of industrialized nations, the right to exercise the greatest influence on economic policies that either fostered an unbridled use of the natural world or an excessive use of fossil fuels that contribute to the rise of carbon in our atmosphere. Humanity, since it was at the heart of creation, matters most, and therefore often at the expense of all other creatures. Connected to this anthropocentrism is the principle of humanity's dominion over creation. Drawing upon the biblical account of creation in Genesis 2, it would appear that the Christian tradition supported the notion that all creation existed only for the sake of humanity, and that God had granted humanity full dominion over that world, and that dominion came within humanity's own rational discretion. In other words, humanity could do whatever it wanted with creation, as they occupied a place in the universe, and I quote, a little lower than the angels, as the psalmist would describe it. Modern theologians have moderated the idea of dominion with the concept of stewardship of creation, but much of the damage to our earth has already been done. Laudato Si crystallized the critique of anthropocentrism and the ideology of dominion, particularly in how the application of technology has exacerbated the impact of those concepts. The encyclical also framed Christianity's response to climate change as an instance of Catholic social teaching coming to fruition. For that reason, the focus and force of Laudato Si is primarily ethical in its theological vision. However, I would like to argue that it is also drawing upon some more positive aspects of Catholic intellectual tradition, aspects that make the encyclical itself to be a more coherent document. Allow me, for the sake of time, to highlight only two specific examples. The first is the motif of nature as a book to be read. theologians who inhabited the medieval universities, there were two textual sources upon which they developed their work. The first was the obvious one, namely Scripture. A master of the sacred page at a university had a primary responsibility of expounding the Bible to his students. But in addition, the created world was also a book in which God revealed himself to humanity. Now, there were a number of assumptions being made in this claim, including some very specific epistemological ones. But the takeaway for modern readers is that the motif gave meaning to nature. Now, one can easily dismiss this motif, as it often descends into simple moralities, in which a facile observation of nature takes on moral meaning. But this motif offered more than just good fodder for the Sunday sermon. One of the theologians I study very closely, that we mentioned, is Robert Grosseteste, a 13th century Englishman who spent the first 50 years of his life as what we would call a scientist. They use the word natural philosopher, before he became a theologian. He's a very interesting character. He's one of the first, actually, to suggest you can describe nature mathematically. He actually comes up with a bit of a Big Bang theory, too. Predates the modern quantum mechanics by a few centuries. In one of his short treatises, he explores how every creature is a mirror of its creator, and that each creature is defined by the concept of unity and trinity. His example is hardly a standard one, however, where he explores a thought experiment about a small object that might appear to defy any further division, a speck of dust. And the Latin word he uses is where we get our modern term atom. Yet, these specks of dust also have substructures that have explored reveal a trinity of qualities that can be accessed through logic and reason. The ontological reality of even the smallest thing reflects the trinitarian nature of its creator. The upshot is that creation is not just to be dominated, or not just stewarded, but it requires our observation, our exploration, and our listening. The second aspect is the concept of microcosm. Drawn from pre-Christian cultures, pre-modern theologians developed the idea that each human contained all the elements that comprise the natural world. For classical physics, there were only 4 elements: earth, fire, air, and water, all of which were found in the human body. Some medieval theologians took this idea to metaphorical extremes, so that a person's hair, eyes, hands, bile, etc., represented some feature of nature or even of human society. At first glance, humanity as a microcosm would appear to be another way to reinforce an anthropocentric understanding of reality. But there is a deeper principle at work here, and one that can mitigate anthropocentrism as a golden. One of the common tensions in the Catholic intellectual tradition is how to understand embodiment. Classical philosophy had argued that the essence of humanity was ultimately found in the mind or the soul, and therefore it was best expressed by rationality or intellectual truth. What prevented human beings from obtaining the good through reason was the body, which was almost like a prison that held the soul back from exploring the good, to use the language strictly of Plato. Even later classical philosophers who did not necessarily see the body as a prison still treated the body as an object to be bridled and controlled because its natural tendencies were towards chaos or irrational action. Christianity developed into its own worldview in which the body was to be honored because it was a creation of God, and an object that God sought to recreate with the act of salvation. But at the same time, the body could be seen as an obstacle to salvation, particularly in terms of bodily needs such as sexual desire, hunger, and emotions, which were considered to be embodied actions. Various religious movements in pre-modern Europe often villainized the body to the point that it was considered to be a completely contemptible thing. The concept of microcosm sought to remind Christian thinkers that the body was part of human existence and human experience. It was the epitome of creation because all the elements were found in it. If the created world was good, then that had to include the human body. One may struggle with immoral and sinful behavior that is most often connected to bodily function, but this did not disconnect the body from the rest of creation. Medieval theologians therefore argued for significant implications of the body as a microcosm. If the human person was a nexus for physicality and spirituality, more honest anthropocentrism was that human existence should be the entry point to understanding creation. This should be true also in terms of scientific discovery, as much as it is about metaphysics and theology. While medieval theology would have understood the observer problem in modern scientific thought if it was explained to him, he would have been a bit mystified as to why this would be such a major issue. This was not only because medieval theologians predated the rise of empiricism, but it was also because humanity as a microcosm spoke to the integration of humanity with nature. The connectivity also worked the opposite way. The English Enlightenment poet Alexander Pope chastised his reader that the proper understanding of mankind was man, instead of spanning the sky. Pre-modern thinkers would not necessarily disagree with Pope's couplet, but the microcosm model reminded them that fuller understanding of humanity lay in the exploration of nature. To understand creation was to come to understand what it meant to be a human being. The concepts of nature as a teaching source and humanity's intimate connection to nature weave their way throughout Laudato Si. Pope Francis's account of an integral ecology, it could be argued, is another way to form the notion of humanity as a microcosm. Clearly, the science has moved beyond the elemental account of creation as we explored the complexity of the earth and the universe over the last 500 years or so. But Pope Francis has drawn upon a tradition that reminds us the importance of humanity not only recognizing its intimate connection to nature, and that this connection demands a more responsible care for our world, as well as the need to listen to it, so we can learn about ourselves as human beings.
Thank you very much, Jim. That certainly was a deep dive into some interesting ideas. Well, Professor Robert Logan is a fellow of St. Michael's College, and he also has very broad-ranging interdisciplinary credentials. Originally a physicist by academic training, he currently teaches the McQueen Seminar, which draws, as some of you might know, on the literary and philosophical legacy of media guru Marshall McLuhan. He also offers a course called What is Information? Love that. And teaches the poetry of physics and the physics of poetry in the University of Toronto Physics Department. And as if that weren't sufficient creativity, he's also the chief scientist of the S Lab at OCAD University, which many of you might know was the art college. So Bob has entitled his presentation, A Media Ecologist / Physicist's Take on Pope Francis's Encyclical. And it's an ecumenical approach to a dialogue on science and religion. Looking forward to this one.
Thank you, Mimi, and Laudato Si to the people that organized this conference. Praise be.
Nicely done.
So I began my ecumenical dialogue when I was a young boy. I'm Jewish. My neighbor Jimmy Hunt was Catholic. One day he came to me and he said, "Bob, it's okay. I talked to the priest. You're not going to go to hell because you don't go to Mass. God has another plan for you." My next ecumenical exercise is with Marshall McLuhan, with whom I worked for 6 years. And I want to dedicate this talk to his memory. So, a fellow named James Peck, U.S. advisor on climate change, wrote, "I used to think that top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And this is why I say, Laudato Si, praise be to the Pope, for his courageous encyclical. And I'd like to add Laudato Si to Greta, who has awoken all of us urgency of the problem of climate change. I am the grandson of a rabbi, Pope Francis, but your encyclical speaks to me on the scientific, ethical, and spiritual level. I am a scientist and a media ecologist, and I am responding to your call in paragraph 62 of the encyclical that science and religion, with their distinctive approaches to understanding reality, can enter into intense dialogue fruitful for both. I'm a member of the Hogwash movement that was formed to deal with nuclear disarmament and other global problems of war and peace. In 1988, at our annual meeting in Dagobus, Russia Today, I helped draft what became the Declaration of Pugwash, a statement to the effect that environmental concerns were as much a threat to human survival as a possibility of nuclear war. I would amend that to say that I believe that it is global warming and climate change that is now the biggest threat to human survival. Furthermore, and I'm sorry to have introduced a donor, but I believe it's already too late in finding a sustainability solution. We really must think about what steps to take to minimize the looming catastrophe and develop a resiliency strategy to save as much of our civilization as possible. I believe that a dialogue with the Catholic Church, other religious groups, such as members of my Jewish community, members of the Pugwash movement, and other scientists is in order. I've made a modest start at St. Michael's College with a series of annual dialogue with scientists and theologians in a symposium entitled Faith, Science, Climate Change, and Pope Francis' Encyclical. Jim Ginther, sitting beside me, was a participant on one of those panels. I believe that a general systems approach, as first formulated by Ludwig von Bertalanffy, is a common ground where scientists and theologians can dialogue, as Pope Francis has urged us to do. By the way, Marshall McLuhan was a fan of Bertalanffy, and Bertalanffy a fan of Marshall McLuhan. They both were general systems thinkers. Pope Francis takes to the task of our political and business leaders, for their lack of foresight, their greenwashing, and they're putting profit and economic growth ahead of human welfare. He then turns to his stock in trade, religion, ethics, and the Bible, where many lessons can be learned as we search for a solution to the problems we face. It is not that the Judeo-Christian tradition is any better than the other wisdom literatures, but it is basically that the cultures that follow the Judeo-Christian traditions are the ones who are responsible for global warming and climate change. And perhaps our wisdom literature can help us now. Those cultures, with their focus on progress interpreted as economic growth, have misread the Hebrew scripture in which it is written in Genesis 1, verse 28. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that creepeth upon the earth. The word subdue is a translation of the Hebrew word kubashi. I do not think that translation of the Hebrew word in the text as subdue is correct, because the root of the word kubashi is better translated as to occupy rather than subdue. The etymology of the word kabush comes from kabuki, another Hebrew word which means to occupy. And that word comes originally from Aramaic, kavash, and from the Akkadian, even older, kavasu, which means to step on something or to occupy. Now, I'm not totally versed in Hebrew. I went to Hebrew school and I learned some Hebrew. But I checked out this idea with my friends in Israel that I do research with. And they did some research and consulted the Even Shushan dictionary, and they agreed with me. In modern Hebrew, the word kubashu means military subduing. But perhaps the original meaning in ancient Hebrew was occupy, and its meaning changed over time. Why I believe that occupy is a better translation than subdue is that later in Genesis 2, verse 15, God puts Adam in the Garden of Eden and tells him to watch over it and tend it, which is certainly not subduing. In Deuteronomy 20, verse 19 and 20, the Hebrews are told They may cut down trees to build a siege engine as long as the trees do not bear fruit, but they are forbidden to cut down fruit trees. The translation of Laudato as and subdue has had the effect of providing European readers of the Bible with a license for subduing or exploiting the bounty of nature for humankind's own immediate selfish ends. The translation of Kubashu into the other languages in Europe has the same connotation that it has in English. Rather than subduing nature, we need to be the stewards of nature. The lack of stewardship of fossil fuels is what has led to our global warming and climate change crisis. But there are other examples as well, where our lack of stewardship has led to serious problems. In the Torah, or the first 5 books of Genesis, there is a mitzvah from God. A mitzvah is a commandment called Laudato Si, do not destroy. It is one of 613 commandments God has given us. Now, you're all familiar with the 10 commandments that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai, but there are 613 of them altogether. And we better pay attention to the commandment of Laudato Si, do not destroy. The parallels of these Jewish teachings and the teachings of Pope Francis in his encyclical are fairly obvious, especially if one considers the following excerpts from Laudato Si, which I will share with you in a moment. There should be no surprise, since both traditions take their roots in the wisdom and holiness of the same text. Pope Francis wrote, quote, "A harmony between the Creator, humanity, and creation as a whole was disrupted by our presuming to take the place of God and refusing to acknowledge our creaturely limitations. This in turn distorted our mandate to have dominion over the earth, to till it and keep it. As a result, the original harmonious relationship between human beings and nature became conflict." He further wrote, "We are not God. The earth was here before us, and it has been given to us. This allows us to respond to the charge that Judeo-Christian thinking on the basis of Genesis account, which grants man dominion over the earth, has encouraged the unbridled exploitation of nature by painting him as a domineering and destructive nature. This is not a correct interpretation of the Bible as understood by the church." Those are the words of Pope Francis. They're also my words too. I will close this talk, or perhaps a homily, with the hope and prayer that our political and business leaders will finally understand the crisis we face. Thank you, and God bless our planet.
Thank you very much, Bob. It's interesting, when you look at the origin of words, I hadn't appreciated, because I had not studied Hebrew, but on Wednesday afternoon in the session on sustainability and the sacred, one of the graduates of the St. Michael's Institute for Ecology and Theology, a young woman, Rosemary Boissonneau, was speaking, and she was talking about
She's right over there.
Oh, there you are, of course. And you tell us about, yes, of course. Tell us about Adam and Adam. That really, I wrote that down. So tell us about that, Rosemary, because the source of that.
Okay, so Adam, I just started studying at the University of
Here, Rosemary.
So Adam literally means human, and Adamah was the dust, the earth from which, in the second Genesis account, which is a lot more ecocentric, I'd say, the dust from which God made Adam. And in the Hebrew, it's Adamah. And it's a feminine derivative of the word Adam. When you add ah, usually on a noun in Hebrew, it makes it feminine. So it sort of evokes a mother-son relationship. And it's very much that, you know, we come from this earth as our mother, and that we're supposed to care for it.
Thank you, and I apologize for not recognizing you. You were wearing different clothes. I wasn't,
Like a,
You know, Rosemary really reminds me of what we say, you know, and we're reminded, especially every Lent, remember, it says man, of course, but, you know, remember that you are dust, and into dust you will return. I mean, we use it all the time, and it's exactly that concept. As Jim has been trying to say too, I think, or has said, there's so many of these elements that are in what we say all the time, and the connection has always been there. Even the word atom and atom, you know, all that sort of thing. The connections are amazing.
Can I just say something strange, because I was on the long subway ride here. I just get that back to you, just so everybody can hear.
I actually was thinking about dust and dust again, because it's slightly different. The word dust isn't adama, it's like, as they say, the dust from the ground, and the adama is, and I talked to my Hebrew professor about that just to clarify. But I was thinking, like, we look at that as a negative thing. Like, we come from dust and back to dust, like, as it's supposed to be a humility, right? And like, we're not so all that. But in a way, it's a beautiful thing. Like, so you came from dust, and while you're living, before you go back to dust, you're still dust and you're still part of that earth. I never made that connection myself after all those.
I've always thought it's beautiful because that shows we are part of planet, you know, in our every atom of this. And even when we die, you know, okay, so our spirit, our soul, depending on your belief in what happens after, but your body disintegrates back to where I've always thought it's beautiful.
Back into your mother's arms.
And it's more than humility to me. It's just this is the reality, you know. Life is just so important.
it's hugely important.
Yeah.
So now comes, this was a great part of our panel discussion, but now comes what everyone always says is the best part of all of these sessions. This is where we get to interact with all of you. So if you've had a chance to either write or think about questions or comments, now is the time to share them.
And I can either bring the microphone around, or you can hand me your bits of paper, or however you want to do it. Do we have someone who would like, because I see a few people have been writing things. Do you want to ask a question or make a comment?
My question is, since we are connecting with the Bible, I'll speak from the Bible. In Genesis 41:54, there were 7 years famine all over, except Egypt. Then we have 10 plagues in Exodus from both the side, from Moses as well as from Pharaoh, right? Then we have Noah's flood. Then we have Bermuda Triangle problem. And in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 8, verse 24, Jesus is sleeping on the boat, and all of a sudden, there's a violent storm. Okay? And dinosaur age, then we are coming out from the ice age. And the tsunamis, twisters, tornadoes, volcano, it has been throughout the creation. So how we can connect? Oh, sorry. All this episode has been throughout Abraham, at the time of Abraham, Noah, right? Jesus, and now. So how we can connect this with collective action of humanity?
So you're sort of saying climate change has been existing.
Yeah,
Throughout.
Without action, right?
Yeah.
But this has been right from before.
It's interesting because, I mean, often, I mean, in the era that I look at, sometimes the question of natural evil comes up, you know, that, you know, you know, can you talk about earthquakes and tsunamis and things as a form of evil actions? In one way in which it was interpreted was this is a form of God's punishment for sin individuals got blamed for things. But it's interesting, we've kind of inverted it now, in a reality that, in some ways, these are the consequences now, the climate change are the increase of more serious storms and stuff as a result of climate change. And that's a result of our own immoral actions. So we've kind of inverted the relationship. That's my observation.
Did I hear the word evil? I want to say that
I was just doing
the people destroying our planet are not evil. They have built into their DNA the following experience. When we humans first occupied the planet, we had a big struggle just to survive. And so we went many days without any food. And then we killed an animal, and then we had a feast. So up until maybe 100 years ago, there was a tremendous struggle for survival. And so people, not because of greed, but just to be able to preserve their existence, tried to gather as much as they could. I love talking about the Bible because I'm a physicist. I have a theologian, two theologians with me. But remember the story about Joseph interpreting the dream. There'd be 7 fat years and 7 lean years. And so he came up with a brilliant idea, build a silo. So throughout history, we have had the problem of starvation. You never knew. Why in China do they eat everything? Insects, you name it, because they experience so many famines, because they have such a large population. So people that are what are called greedy, it's sort of built into them, because that was the way the human race survived. So I wouldn't call it evil, I would just call it stupid. Because people are not cognizant of what they're doing is destroying the possibility of life for their children, their grandchildren, and their children and grandchildren.
And I guess I think that with a huge reliance on scripture and, the sort of dynamic stories of Noah's flood, which is really a big moral message to us, but then the realities in the physical world of the Ice Age, so the combination again of reality and scriptural, if you like, more metaphorical approach to what happens to us. We need to look at both and say, yeah, these things incredible. I mean, the Ice Age. How do you explain the Ice Age? People.
That's what I'm trying.
Yeah,
What
yeah.
I'm trying to connect is,
Yeah.
we know that Noah's flood is because of the corruption, right? We know that. But in Egypt, the 10 plagues, which is coming one from the finger of God through Moses, and the other one is also coming from Pharaoh's magician, right? So, and Jesus sleeping in a boat, all of a sudden violent storm. So that storm is definitely not sending by God, and Jesus is stopping. So that means it was a phenomenon in Egypt, in Galilee, and the shipwreck of Paul in Malta for 14 days, right? Storm. So everything we cannot connect because of our cause and effect. But something is natural, and if we read the book of Stephen Hawking, The Grand Design, it has been always hostile, right? All of a sudden you find something happening. So I'm not opposing what Pope Francis is saying, or what the climate change, and what climate change promote, right? With help of science. But it is always plus and minus, we cannot sometimes, it's a mystery.
Okay, I take that point, and I think partly what I was saying too is that idea we're looking at the natural world, but it takes more than a look. It's not just the physical world in itself, but we have to understand the physical realities too. But there's something deeper there that has to come into play, which I think is what the Pope's saying. that, the idea of the messages we have received from things like Noah's flood, all those sorts of things, that in a way should be pointing us towards, being more aware of God, the creation, and care for the creation. What I find interesting is that the Pope, as a trained scientist himself, that was one of his first degrees, another chemistry and interdisciplinary approach from him too, is accepting the metrics, today's metrics, as the best indicators of the physical reality. So it's accepting the fluorocarbon, and he's accepting all those on the scientific level, because we can actually see what's happening. But at the same time, I think he is dealing with the problem of evil, not natural evils. If Noah's flood took place, okay. If the plague of locusts, okay. All of them brought messages to us, moral messages, implications for how we should treat each other and the planet. Although they wouldn't have said planet in scripture, obviously. But I think the Pope is really almost, urging us. He is urging us to take these realities seriously. And he's saying, as many people will say, it's either too late, or this is human nature, or people are not evil. But he is saying something quite different. I think he's pointing to some of these corporations. He's pointing to the mining, companies that have upped and left, not just the Amazon, but many other continents, and left behind tragedy with total non-foresight, as non-concern about how other people will, are left to deal with it, the profit motive. He actually says that. So he's not saying, he's not he won't condemn individuals, if you like. That's another very specifically Catholic approach of talking about objective realities. But evil means harm has been caused. And so we can see all these harms. And so he's saying, if we see harm, isn't it part of human nature to try and redress balance? And that's why I find it such an interesting issue of the scientific realities, even although there's doubt and skepticism and arguments back and forward, which only time will probably show, which side really had the better insight into all of this. It's an ongoing development. But to me, and taken from Pope Francis, the human reality of how we interact with other people and how all those parts are interconnected. So, people are left without work, but at the same time, the land is also spoiled. All that deforestation, the land is spoiled, people are left without work, etc. But the impact on everybody else is also great. So the interconnectedness of it. I would use the word moral evils if it's something that's damaging and in the sense of justice other people see. That's in fact what people are doing these days. We need to do something about this. The whole point of this conference, I presume, and many others like it globally, are that we do need to do something about it. And I think that's what in Laudato Si, the Pope is saying that to everybody. Every one of us is responsible, no matter at what level. So some of the things I might not think are evil, maybe I have to rethink. He's pitching it at a very low level. He talks about wearing extra sweaters in the winter. I mean, he puts that in his encyclical.
When his call to action is very specific and very individual.
Usually, yeah. He's up to the topics.
I think there was a question here.
Yeah.
Sorry, I went a bit for
Well, I'm Parul from India, and I may seem a little off track to the kind of discussion that is going on because I come from an entirely different cultural background following the Hindu sect of India. I'm okay with the kind of views which have been expressed by the panelists. But my concern is that most of the things which we are right now talking about, and I'll say to some extent sharing the preachings of our esteemed leaders in respective faiths, how to convince the modern generation who's not following that belief system, who's having altogether a different set of belief systems, or who are challenging what has been written decades and decades and decades before in scriptures without any empirical establishment of those facts. And in today's time, when we talk about the freedom of thought and the freedom to follow our own belief systems, so how to convince today's generation, maybe you and me can have a kind of agreement on some aspect, but today's generation will ask for facts and figures. So what should we do exactly to just convince them in a manner that what we are saying is actually true?
Maybe let them answer. But then
I can
oh, you want to
speak-
add something?
Okay, I think she wants to
Can I just
I
add something?
add to
I
that.
have a response.
Yeah, so do we all.
Om Tat Sat.
Okay, let's just,
And we can learn something from India. Mahatma Gandhi was an environmentalist. And he taught us a lesson of doing things by hand instead of always relying on machines, burning fossil fuels.
It's true. It's not India and Canada or US. It's a general phenomenon, universal phenomena I'm going to talk about. Yes, you may.
Yeah, so I guess it's kind of similar to her question. Sorry, yeah. I guess it's similar to her question. My question is more, how do we address the questions and concerns about the interpretation of different religious books to address the relationship of nature and humans? Because I feel like a lot of people are questioning those relationships based on the religious translations. For example, like in the Genesis, they say that, as you mentioned, that everything that was created was made for only for human use or and for their own benefits. And what about the other species? What about nature? And sorry, what about other species? Or what about for like why for their sake too? So my question is, sorry. So how do we create conversations that would help those people who are trying to connect spirituality and nature, but find it hard because of the many translations that have been going on since, I don't know.
yeah. The notion of dominion,
Yeah.
which is only recently being, well, rephrased as stewardship. And I think that's a relatively recent
It is,
rephrasing.
it is.
So let me answer first anecdotally. I have two daughters, one's 16 and one's 19. And their approach to religious expression and the environment is very different from what I was raised on. In some ways, I have huge hope for this generation because they're actually asking the questions that about our responsibility in caring for creation. And one of our frustrations as leaders within, our Christian traditions, and I speak specifically because that's my tradition. I'm just finishing up a book called "You Lost Me," which is about basically the millennials parting from the church, and it's because nobody is really seriously answering the questions they're asking. So, to be honest, the solution that you're looking for is answer the damn questions. I mean, if they're asking, how do we be responsible for better stewards of the environment? How does that fit into the Christian tradition? If they're asking the questions, then we have a responsibility to answer it. So I think that's, in some ways, it's a pretty obvious one. But it's a hard one because in some ways, there is still kind of a struggle of how we kind of connect this. But there's been so much work done by theologians, to give us a way to think about this in a much more effective way to bring our Christian tradition. Connected to that too, I think, is that one of the things that St. Mike's is really, really interested in is interfaith dialogue. How do we bring our own tradition in dialogue with other faiths? How do we learn from them? And one of the things that I'm trying to do as a dean is saying, okay, that's fantastic. How do we bring in talking about environment, about equal responsibility, things like that? How do we bring that into the conversation so that we're learning from other faiths and we're helping each other, respond to this generation. If I can connect this also to the first question that was asked, because I apologize for not fully understanding what you're asking in the first instance. In some ways, the ferocity of nature itself, as I said, some people interpret this as God's judgment or it's a negativity, and I think, sometimes people think, well, nature's been ferocious forever. This is not just about climate change. When I look at the ferocity of nature, I think, wow, this notion of dominion, for us to subdue nature, dream on.
Exactly.
It reminds me that humanity can never fully control nature. So that so that's why stewardship becomes the better way to manage that relationship. you know, and sometimes we're going to be at the mercy of nature. But it reminds us that we're part of it as opposed to the one over top of it. So I think those two concepts coming together might be a way forward, but the details really have to be still worked out. So.
I'd like to comment, and I think if you don't mind, maybe before
Yeah,
the
no,
next
and then the next question.
Yeah, I'll try to be faster.
No,
this
go
time.
ahead.
Yeah, but it's just because it's always so complicated anyway, with short answers obviously don't really fit the bill. But I guess
this later also.
But from the tradition I'm speaking from, so much emphasis has always been placed on the factual, on the scientific. So I look at, there's a book I use when I'm teaching ethics, you know, and it's called Reason Illuminated by Faith. So as a theologian, obviously I'm looking at both aspects, as Catholic theology has really stresses the importance of both aspects. And that's, and of course, Pope Francis is coming clearly from that tradition. And so the emphasis on factual knowledge is, I mean, I don't think you can have good ethics unless you have correct information. One doesn't really come before the other. You know, Thomas Aquinas again would say we're basing our ethics on our experience of what's actually happening out there. And so we have to look at that, see what's going on. I mean, the whole process in the Catholic Church of evangelization is to try and get our own people back to thinking in terms of linking all these points together. So the big question today for millennials and older, because most of my kids fit, I have one millennial and the rest are older. So when we have conversations around the dinner table, etc., you know, with my grandchildren, etc., the questions they're asking, they're not looking to me for what does the Catholic Church say. I wish they were, but they're not many levels. But what they're interested in, and what I'm also interested in, is what's the reality, what's going on, what has caused all these things, what are they doing in school or the different justice programs to counteract it. Their awareness level is much higher these days, and I think that is a sign of hope. So I think the approach, while we're connecting, many of us, the religious, spiritual, with the reality, I think that's what theology and the spiritual should be doing. I mean, I think for me as an ethicist, as I said, the factual side and good answers, good science, good broader knowledge, you know, not just that reaction and, you know, all that sort of thing. I think it's fundamental. I think that's part of why this particular encyclical has become a kind of a watchword, so not just for Catholic teaching, because the Pope was trying to do that. He was talking to the reality out there and what we could do, but also giving it this underlying or overlaying, I don't know, of the different contributions that religious people make, because we do have a view of looking after the earth, whether we call it dominion, stewardship, or whatever. We know we're part of it, we know we're responsible for it. And the idea of the common good, which is huge. That means I have to think about my responsibility now for what my grandchildren are going to be reaping in the future. And I think that comes pretty normally to most humans, you know, that.
That's true, but ultimately we are trying to mold the belief systems of the new generation in our way. We are not allowing them the freedom to think in their own way. They might have a better perspective which we are not able to embrace because we are connected to a particular scripture or particular belief system. So that may also be true to some extent.
It could be true, that's right.
Can you hear me?
To the young
There's a
person,
question there.
Yeah.
Okay. First, a disclaimer, I'm not a theologian, all right? So I address my question first to the theologians and then to you. When I read the creation theology in Laudato Si, I find it's ecumenical and Jewish, and it's based on Jürgen Moltmann synthesis, okay? I just read this book on creation theology, but that struck me. If I look at the citation, is not mentioned, I think that's politically correct, right? Okay, so that's the first point, and that's very important because Christians come Jewish make about 1/3 of mankind, right? So, I mean, if that third of mankind was really carrying the message, we might see some transformation. A second point is that for what I know of other religions, I don't know any religion which is anti-environment. They are all favorable to nature somehow, okay? So there is opportunity for cooperation there. And then my second question is totally unrelated and addressed to you because you are a scientist. The Pope shows great respect for natural science. A marvelous step since the days of Galilei, okay? But for social sciences, I don't see it. I know the social scientists who are on his Academy of Social Sciences. There are statements in the encyclical which have never gone through if they are invented by those people.
I think that was more a statement than a question.
Yes, but you may react to it.
What would you like me to say?
I find that surprising. I think all sciences deserve respect, even they have limitations. All sciences have limitations.
I agree.
Okay.
Yeah, this question is also for you as well. I just wanted to clarify something that you mentioned about how the climate crisis was too catastrophic to solve and that you don't see sustainability being the solution. Do you mind just elaborating? It sounded like it, yeah. It did sound like that. So that's why I want to clarify.
What I said is sustainability. The notion that we could find a sustainable way of doing things, it's too late.
Like right now it's too late, or?
Set into motion, you set into motion things that cannot be reversed. We're going to have a catastrophe in 30, 40, 50 years from now. And we better get ready for it. This notion that, oh, if we can hold the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, it'll be okay. Well, that's what Trudeau is campaigning on, right? Well, that's nonsense. We're going to hit. We're going to raise more than 1.5. We're going to see oceans flooding with places like Florida and other low-lying regions. Already, there's an island in the middle of the Pacific where the former prime minister of that island has bought land on another territory so that people can migrate there. Just like the Jews went out of Egypt. He wants his people to go to leave their island because it's going to be underwater. We have to accept that reality. The only person that really understands what's going on is 16 years old, and her name is Greta. So in response to you, don't look to us, to our generation. The solution lies with your generation. And I'm here to help you if I can before I pass on. I'm already 80, so I'm not going to be around when the real catastrophe happens. But if there are any students in this audience that are members of the Mississauga campus environmental program, talk to me after this, because I'd love to join your program. Are you in the program?
I'm in the sustainability.
Right?
Yeah, cool.
Let's talk.
Hi, I just want to know what's your definition of sustainability? What's your definition of sustainability?
The notion of sustainability is the idea that if we can keep the rise in global temperature to 1.5 degrees, everything will be okay. And that if we can just start reducing the consumption of fossil fuels and go to green energy, everything will be fine. But there's another curve that you have to take into account. There are now 7.7 billion people on this planet. And the curve looks like this. And it's projected to go like this. This planet cannot sustain 10 billion people. It will not be able to sustain 15 billion people. If you look at how short a time ago it was when we were at 3.35 billion. The doubling time to go to 15 billion is not very many years from now. The planet cannot sustain that many people, plain and simple. That's my definition of sustainability.
So I think it's not that it's too late to be sustainable, but maybe it's too late to be unsustainable. We need to start to be sustainable.
Say it again, hard to hear.
Yeah, so I said that maybe it's not that it's too late to be sustainable, but it is too late to be unsustainable.
It's not too late to be unsustainable. Our wisdom is coming from the young people.
That's right. It's a good thing. Yeah. Okay. And then we'll go back to Mimi and let her do direct.
Yeah, same as.
Yeah.
Talk to me afterwards, please.
About your last point, the UN expects a leveling off around 2050 at 9 billion. Okay, so talking about a population larger than 9 billion, as far as we know now, is unrealistic.
The UN says it'll level off at 9 billion?
Yeah, 9 billion.
It'll level off to even lower levels, because when the disaster hits, there's going to be a massive die-off. We know that many species have destroyed their environment and they became extinct.
And it's an interesting conversation, because what we're having is a conversation of worldviews, right? And your scientific worldview brings different information to the top for you. Are there other people who would like to weigh in terms of a question or a thought to our panelists here? Yeah.
It's not so much as a question, it's just but it does address what you were saying. My problem has been to get people of deep faith to pay attention to this, not people who don't have a faith to draw into it. I work a lot with climate activists, and I have two very good atheist friends who are talking to me about this all the time. I go and talk to my parish priest about it, and he didn't even have a copy of it. I had to give him one, and he was like, "What was that you're talking about?" So there is a great divide even within the Catholic faith in terms of who is taking this seriously. And it's most of it isn't about, well, the Catholics say this and this and this, and this is how you have to do it. There's only a very thin section that actually says, well, okay, now we're going to address it specifically from a Catholic, like it's from Catholic moral theology, but from Catholic actual teaching in terms of doctrine, it's a very small section. So, and if I could just, one really quick thing, also addressing, as a supporter of Fridays for Future, I find the young people, because they're dealing with eco-anxiety, and they're looking for a spiritual answer, not necessarily give me a list of, doctrines I need to follow, but they're searching for spirituality. I know Fridays for Future in Toronto, we've done a couple of interfaith things together at their request. I don't know if any of you were at the meditation that we did in June on Queen's Park. Instead of striking, we had a meditation session in front of Queen's Park. So I think it's kind of a new type of spirituality that's coming out. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, I'm following Buddhism exactly, or Hinduism, I should say, or Catholicism, but that sense of there is a spirituality to the earth and the connectedness. And I've been to a bunch of different sessions, and everyone, whether you're talking about Hewlett-Packard, talking about their, I don't know, their renewable cartridges or whatever, we end up talking about relationships. The solution is in relationships. Relationships to the earth, but relationships with community, with one another. I've been to a lot of the spiritual stuff, but I've been to some of the more like carbon pricing type stuff. But everybody's talking about relationships, and that's, I think, what is the key. So not necessarily a set of doctrine, but developing that a spirituality based on earth and each other.
Thank you for that, Rosemary. Our time actually is up, so I'm just going to say 2 or 3 words, going back to the notion of connectedness that we started, and your comment about relationships speaks directly to that. And you were talking about the common good, and of course in the encyclical, there's a great deal of reference to the common good. And what we really are looking for, I think, as individuals and as we relate to others, is we want to know how to be good and how to do good. And when we're coming from that perspective, in our relationships to others, our relationship to the earth, we want to do no harm, and we want to do good. We want to improve things. So if we can move towards some sense of sustainability, it will be through being and doing good, and connecting with others who want to be and do good. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for doing good by sharing your ideas with us. And I encourage you all to enjoy, as you have been, the rest of this wonderful conference. And thank you for being part of this panel discussion.
Laudato Si.